Welcome to the channel. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Today I've got a bit of a treat from Watchdives. It isn't a new release, but it's one which stood out to me quite recently. It's called the WD6105, which should give you a clue as to what this watch is a homage of. Now just on this point, I want to sidetrack a little bit, but still keep it relevant. See, the 6105 base has been very popular amongst watch enthusiasts, and as a result, AliExpress has given us countless versions over the years. And I've done many comparisons between some of the more popular ones. Now from my point of view, the Steel Dive SD1970 is the absolute GOAT. It's very cheap, amazing, and it has unbeatable value for money and those classic looks. We also had the $100 version, which had a couple more vintage aspects to it, but then the rectangular came along and gave us the most authentic reinterpretation of the 6105. I stopped getting the 6105 homages for review as I felt they were all the same, aside from different branding. That was until I saw this from Watchdives. Now they do have a couple of colorways, which I think they released a while ago. You've got the standard black, the standard blue, but those are not the ones I'm interested in. It's a very particular colorway or variant that caught my eye. It's this sunburst blue dial with the gold accents and a new bracelet. They've also done a couple more subtle changes which I think makes it stand out, and it gets a place right next to the brands which I mentioned earlier, which I'll get into shortly. First, let's give you an overview of the technical details. So we have a flat sapphire crystal with a beveled edge. You also have a glossy aluminium bezel insert with a 120 click unidirectional diving bezel, the economic and reliable Seiko NH35 automatic movement powering this, and an alleged 200 meters of water resistance backed up by a screw-down crown and a screw-down caseback. Now you get all this plus very decent packaging, all for under £100. Currently there is a sale, so it's down to around £92, and with coupons you get it for around £88. I mean, it still can't beat the Steel Dive, but I think it gives a little more than the GOATed SD1970. So you still have the same dimensions as most of them, and the only thing that stands out with this one is the weight. It is a heavy 180 grams plus due to the new bracelet, but it does come down to around 160-ish size for my 6.5 inch wrist, which is a lot more reasonable but still pretty weighty. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of this version by Watchdives which made this model stand out to me. So the first thing was of course the dial, not the blue sunburst but the handset, and in particular the gold accents which they've homaged from one of the special editions released by Seiko for the reissue of the 6105. It's a trick which I think a lot of people have missed. Now I like how the fine gold lettering above the 6 is present, but it's not overpowering as perhaps the logo below the 12 o'clock is. I also like the white loomed hour markers, still in that traditional shape, really well aligned. You've got polished frames as well as a frame around the date at 3. Now the second thing on the dial which stood out was the handset. It's not the usual baton hands, and one thing which did annoy me about the SD1970 was the V2 was a bit of a cost saving model, as the hands went from being beveled edges to really flat thin hands, which made it look very cheap. Now it's one of the things on the $100 which is great. They use linear brushed hands with polished bevels on either side, and it adds a level of quality to the dial. Now this one is a little different. You don't have the polished bevels on either side, but you have a central chamfer and with coarse brushing. They've tried to emulate the ones that Seiko use on the reissue, but just without the one side being polished. Now they've also downsized the hour hand just a touch. Notice how it perfectly suits the square hour markers. It also has a fine arrowhead, and the brushing makes it quite visible and really well defined. That being said, on close-ups you can see some poor finishing on the back of the hands, which when you take the price into consideration, it does make sense. Now the brushed gold seconds hand is a really nice touch, but I feel they could do with a little bit more length, and this particular watch does also have a very visible speck of dust right next to the date window, which is bugging me quite a bit. Now I don't like everything about this watch. It's just a few key things which were different to the rest. I think this shiny aluminium bezel insert isn't that nice. I would have preferred a matte aluminium or even a brushed ceramic or a brushed steel version. But the bezel rotation is really nice and smooth. You've got very nice clicks, consistent rotation, and it does line up nicely. And the lume is also pretty decent. It's solid BGW9 color. You have a nice even glow with no patchiness. I think the longevity may suffer as this lume isn't that punchy, but again, it is in line with cost, so I think it's fine. Now notice how you have excellent paint match between the hands and the indices. Usually when using C3, if the handset is of poorer quality or the dial, you get a visible mismatch in lume color, but this is spot on. Now moving on to the case, there isn't much to talk about. It is similar to the rest. Nothing really that stands out here except poor quality, as this arrived with a bit of a damage on the side, a bit of a blemish there, which was obviously caused by touching or knocking. Now, even though the watch was really well protected, that only means one thing, that this happened before the shipping point. So 2 points here which highlight the main issues with budget brands on AliExpress, which is just poor quality control and poor standards, which is the trade-off we all make when we buy from these watch brands. Now, the crown function is solid. It's a 6mm crown and it fits nicely into the iconic crown guards. The polishing is nicely done. You've got a smooth case back with your usual specifications on there. Now moving swiftly on from the case, the bracelet is actually the main thing which drew me to this watch. We've only ever seen those crappy 3-link bracelets which feel a little jangly, hollow, and they tend to ruin the watch. I always say that the 6105s and the 62 mass look better on rubber straps. Now this one isn't so bad. It does have a solid end link with really good fit. You have a solid 5-link design with a modernized 6 micro adjustable clasp. The clasp has much finer brushing than the bracelet, which means it's off the shelf. The adjustments on there are plenty and quite useful due to the smaller links of the bracelet. Now the links are held together by pretty decent split pins, which slot in and out quite easily enough. You've got polished sides and fully brushed links. The brushing is nicely done. No inconsistencies on the grain. It is coarser than on the clasp and they look quite nice. Now there are 5 individual links, but they don't fully articulate. But I'd say there is plenty of flexibility in the bracelet and it does wrap nicely around the wrist. Now on wrist, it is a little scratchy as you put it on. Reviewers feel this a lot more because we remove the watch and put it back on a lot more and so many times, so we can feel these kind of things. But on wrist, it is quite comfortable. The bracelet fits nicely. You've got good weight across the whole watch and there's no real head wobble. But you do feel the curved case back quite a bit on the wrist. Now if they could have sunk that case back in a little deeper, then you would feel the very comfortable cushion case a lot more. But overall it's quite nice to wear, and I think the main thing for me was that subtle blend of design between the new reissue models and the OG Willard looks, which they have executed fairly well. Obviously aside from the 2 quality issues, which is anyone's guess what they will be getting in the post. Build wise, I am pretty happy with what you get for your £80. And while I won't say it is better than the SD1970, I'd say it's different enough to get one, as it just has a little more to offer. So over to you guys, the experts. What are your thoughts on this? And let me know below. That's it from me today. Thank you all for tuning in and I will see you on the next video.